So I'm one of the third-year residents at Emory University. Today we're going to be talking about Captains of Chaos, building a leadership curriculum for emergency medicine residents. This is a picture. I have a print of this photograph in my living room at home. I bought it about 7 years ago, and I was never quite sure about why I liked it so much. I mean, I love fishing, I like the sea, but there was something about it that I always connected with. Maybe it's the idea the world's kind of on its side, there's water pouring over the bow, and yet if you look at the fishermen, they're just standing there, another day at work. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of emergency medicine. And I hope that if you were to walk into my emergency room, you might see something like this scene. The world's kind of on its side, there's lots of fluid all over the place, and I'm standing there in the middle of it all, calm, collected, truly a captain of the chaos. Now, we've all seen leadership. We've seen good leadership, bad leadership, meh leadership. But what I want to talk about today is how can we get here? How can we get here, and how can we teach our residents to get here? Now, I'd like you to raise your hand if at any point during your last shift in the emergency room you would consider yourself a leader in the department at any point during your last shift. Okay, great. Now keep your hand up if at any point during residency you received formal leadership training. Either your hands are tired or no one got it, except for a few here. So that's what we're going to talk about today. As a graduating senior resident, my life right now is all about numbers. How many shifts I have left, how many days until graduation. But here are two other numbers. 421. That's the number of hours I've spent in didactic sessions over the past 3 years. Approximately 1% of those focused on leadership explicitly. Now, we learn the basics, we learn chest tubes, we learn EKGs, differential diagnoses. But I would argue that leadership skills are just as important to our profession, and as everyone here just demonstrated by raising your hand, just as important for what we do day in and day out. So I would argue that what we teach does not equal what we do. I think that this is something that can be addressed, it's something that should be addressed. In 2015, the ACGME released a paper. It was a short paper calling on all postgraduate programs to develop leadership curricula. Now, it was very short on the specifics and essentially called for, maybe some small group discussions, some lectures, some mentoring programs, and then sessions at the large national meetings, like what we have at SAEM. But how do we take that? How do we take that call and translate it into action? So at Emory, we started with the evidence. What's already out there? Let's not reinvent the wheel. There's got to be someone out there teaching leadership. And so went and looked around. Now, there are a few papers that kind of surveyed the landscape. They look at what various programs are doing. By and large, the vast majority of residencies do not include formal leadership curricula. There was a talk yesterday morning by Kushal Shah and the team at Mount Sinai in New York, where I went to medical school, and they're starting a leadership curricula. It sounds great. I wish they'd had it when I was a student. But that's the exception. That's not the rule. And so that was essentially what we found. The most widely published program is out of the internal medicine residency at MGH, where they worked in collaboration with their colleagues at Harvard Business School, and they built an optional leadership curriculum for their residents that closely parallels one of the most popular HBS leadership courses. Now, they do small group discussions, they have lectures, it's built largely around the business school style cases, and then they also have a mentoring component. What the Harvard Business School class is, the larger framework, is that they look at experience, they want reflection on that experience, and then feedback from your colleagues. And so that was if you take the 10,000-foot view, that's what we tried to do as well, and that's what we built on. At Emory, we created a series of 3 workshops, also some asynchronous content, and then we came up with a novel way to assess our leadership curriculum. Here's the outline for all 3 of our workshops. Essentially, we learn by doing. So every workshop begins with a group exercise that illustrates key leadership concepts. To give you an example, one of the ways that we open up our workshop is we do a game called the helium stick. Everyone stands, they stand across from each other, place their fingers like this, we lay a stick across the top, and the whole purpose is you have to bring the stick down, you got to bring the stick back up. It sounds easy. remarkably difficult. It takes somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes, and it usually works best if you have someone in the group stands up and says, I'm going to be the leader, everyone take direction off me. But it only works if everyone else in the group recognizes them as the leader and agrees to follow. And so once they figure out the activity, once they complete the exercise, you break it down and you have them say, why did you follow that one person? What was it about what they said that made you want to follow? Why didn't you step up and be the leader? Was it something about their body language? They seemed more certain? What was it? And so you break down these non-medical exercises, but you talk about how they demonstrate leadership. So that's how the workshop starts. We then reflect and share. As I said, we've all seen leadership. We've all seen good leadership and bad leadership. We've all been part of good codes and bad codes. We've all seen things outside of codes, just difficult patients, difficult family members, and how there are attendings who we admire, some who we may not admire as much, but we provide a space for the residents to come together and share their best practices. Third, we look at the evidence. It's rather paltry, especially compared to the business world, but what you see is that there is some stuff out there. So in the emergency medicine literature, there was a WestGem review in 2016 looking at trauma resuscitations. And it looked at how leadership styles and trauma resuscitations can lead to better or worse outcomes depending on the style. In pediatrics, there's an interesting group out of Israel, neonatal intensivists, who have done some fascinating studies looking at rudeness between consultants and the medical team. And they showed that when you have a rude conversation, it leads to worse medical decision making. So there's a lot of literature out there in the broad world. There's not a lot that comes from emergency medicine, but we try and bring some of that in and again get the conversation started around what best practices may be. And then we have asynchronous content, and we send out emails chock full of news articles, other studies, interesting things related to leadership, and we send those out in between the workshops. Here's the first workshop, getting down to really the workshop level and what our narrative arc is for each one. So in the first workshop, we look at what is leadership. Why are we all at the workshop? Why are we talking about it? Why is it important? You know, again, it's something that we all see, but we rarely get that space in residency to step back and say, separate from the medical management, what does leadership look like? And then, again, why is it important? The second workshop, how do I lead? As a resident, what is my own leadership style? Some people, loud, head of the bed, maybe shouting at everyone. Other people, the quiet leader. What this picture is actually a connect the dots, has about 205 dots on there, and it's a picture of two penguins facing each other. So this workshop, we begin by having residents pair off, and one person has the connect the dots with all of the lines filled in. The other person just has dots, no numbers, nothing. And the first resident has to direct the second one how to draw the picture. Inevitably, people get frustrated. I think one person completed it the first time that we did it. But you break it down and you say, why did you get frustrated? What about this experience was frustrating for you? If you were giving directions, what did you do well? What did you not do well? What is your own style of leadership? The third workshop, which we're going to be doing in June, is looking at how can I improve? How can I get better as a leader myself? We're having residents bring their own cases, their own successes and failures, bring it to a small group, and really dissect it as a group. What worked? What didn't work? Maybe I wouldn't have used that language in that particular situation, and moving forward you may want to think about doing it another way. Again, it's the pair and share idea, but broadening it out to a small group and really thinking in the future, what can I do better? We're also going to hear from the experts. We asked the residents, among our attending faculty, who are the ones that you admire for their leadership abilities? We have a panel of 3 amazing leaders from our department who are going to come together. They all have very different leadership styles, and we're going to do a Q&A with them where we can really talk, again, separate from medical management, how do you lead your department? Does it work? The million-dollar question, where the rubber meets the road. Now, the leadership literature essentially falls into 2 buckets. On the one hand, you have assessing leadership curricula. You have people who do pre- and post-intervention surveys, and they usually survey participants. They'll ask, did you like the curriculum? Did you become a better leader because of it? Do you feel more comfortable? And almost across the board, the results are overwhelmingly positive. People feel better, they think they're better leaders, but there's not much objective data. In the other bucket, you have large management consulting firms that will survey 5,000 clients and say, what are the leadership qualities that you're looking for? And they'll get all this data, they publish it, and they say, here are the 3 leadership qualities that all of our clients think are the most important. And wouldn't you know, we happen to have a lovely suite of options that we will sell you to train you in these 3 qualities. That's where most of the data is. That's where most of the published studies, they fall into one of those 2 buckets. I know I just got done bashing pre- and post-intervention surveys, but we are doing a survey for ours. It's a self-leadership questionnaire. It's a 9-question survey that was derived from a larger 30-question survey, which is a well-validated tool. It's not assessing our curriculum. It's a way for residents to look at their own leadership styles. It looks at communication, teamwork, and creativity. And we're having them complete the survey before the first workshop and at the end of the third, and then really looking to see, does their score change? Are there certain areas within these leadership domains that they improved upon? Then we're doing simulation assessments. So at Emory, every resident does a simulation assessment twice a year. We do one in the fall, we do it in the spring, and you do 2 cases. Now, during the assessment, each assessment has 2 cases, excuse me. Now, the cases are medically complicated somewhat, but they're relatively straightforward, meaning that there was one where it was an eclamptic patient who started having seizures, and once you figured out that she was pregnant, the case was pretty straightforward. However, she also didn't speak English, so you had a language barrier. And halfway through the case, her irate husband bursts into the room and tries to disrupt the simulation. So there are components to these sims that are not just straightforward medical. What we added this year is we added a question at the end of the simulation for the resident, the faculty assessor, and for the standardized nurse in the room to assess the resident's leadership ability. So that way we can try to get some objective data, again, 3 data points, 2 cases, so that's 6 data points, and you do it twice a year. And really try to figure out, is there a way to objectively measure the impact that we're having or not having on our residents' leadership skills? Limitations. The main limitation is that at no point today have you heard me say, here's how to be a good leader. Here are the 3 things that we're looking for you to be a great emergency medicine leader. And part of that is that I don't think they exist. And the reason I don't think they exist, again, if you go back to the data, it shows that different situations and different team structures require different types of leadership. You need to be flexible. A certain situation, seasoned nurses running a code with you, maybe more of a collaborative style. If you then have a case where it's you and a medical student, maybe a little bit more directive. So it requires a certain amount of flexibility, but we have intentionally avoided being prescriptive when we do these workshops. We don't want to tell people there's only one way to lead. What we've tried to do, we've tried to create a space. We've tried to start a conversation with the residents. What does leadership look like? How do I lead, and how can I get better? What we teach does not equal what we do. At least that's the current state of medical education, and especially when it comes to leadership training. Leadership needs to be taught. I agree with the ACGME that it should be part of every curriculum, and if I haven't met you yet, I'd love to meet you afterwards and hear about what you're doing in your own shops, and if you have any other feedback, any other ideas, I'd love to talk about it. And does it work? I don't know. I don't know yet if it works or not. That's why we're collecting the data. And again, I'd love to partner with anyone else out there interested in this topic who wants to figure out, is there a way that we can teach this? Is there a way we can teach it better? And more importantly, let's get the conversation started. So when I go home tonight, fly back to Atlanta, kiss my wife, play with my dog, and sit on the couch. And I'll be looking at this picture and looking at these fishermen and wondering, how can I be a captain of chaos? Thank you. All right. Questions?
Do you think your ultimate goal is to create better leaders while they're working in the emergency department, your residents, as opposed to their non-clinical leadership roles?
Yes. So it's a great question. I think that the leadership qualities that are required in our job, I think they transcend just our shift work. But the focus, again, in residency at least, Our focus with this curriculum is trying to create better on-shift leaders. And when I say create better leaders, I think part of it, a big goal, is teaching people how to lead with intent, making them more aware that whether you like it or not, as a resident or as the attending, you are a de facto leader in the emergency department. You have nurses, you have EKG techs, you work as part of a team. And so it's really being aware that whether you like it or not, that's a role that you inhabit. And so trying to start that conversation and start that awareness of how you can lead with intent.
Sar, amazing work. You know, just I think this is a bold sort of first step to capture something that we all think about, makes sense intuitively, and to sort of formalize it. I'm just wondering, are there things that are there things that you think about sort of in terms of are there things that you think about in terms of sort of practical skills, toolkits, you know, things that are like, you know, we call them soft skills, but things like persuasion, negotiations, conflict resolution, those types of things that you think can fold into this, or do you think that that's sort of something to handle maybe in parallel or separately?
I think it's a great question, and I 100% agree that there's an incredible breadth of knowledge and skills that are required to be a great leader. I don't pretend that we can teach all of them in 3 workshops. So I do think that there's a huge amount of opportunity to teach them in parallel. As you said, it is a starting place. It's really getting that conversation started and getting people to start thinking about leadership as something that we're actively doing. I would love to have both the time and the resources to be able to build, you know, a parallel curriculum where you really dive into the hard skills. But I think that in 3 workshops, and these are hour-long workshops that are optional for the residents, I don't know that I'd be able to do justice to negotiation or some of the other hard skills that you're talking about. You know, there is training in difficult conversations. There is training in maybe managing difficult nurses and things like that during residency, but it's not necessarily formalized. And I think that we can do more just, again, about the entire conversation of what does leadership look like.
Hey, thank you. My name's Lance Becker from New York. And have you tried to use video to capture the data and then subject that to an objective scoring? Like, I sort of come from the school of, if you can't measure it, makes it really hard to improve it, you know?
Sure.
And it would seem like part of what you're doing would definitely adapt itself to keeping it as a database on video and then having external people apply some sort of a score to that so that maybe you could uncover something. But
certainly. We talked about it with the simulations. The simulations are all recorded, so we have that data. We unfortunately didn't have the resources to essentially have the independent scoring of it. One of the main constraints is that since I myself am a resident, I can't score my colleagues, and you know, there were all sorts of issues with that from a data standpoint. What we tried to do, when I say that we assessed the leadership during the simulation, or I guess we had the resident, the assessor, and the standardized nurse assess leadership, we built a question. It came from one of the, essentially the Harvard papers, the internal medicine residency papers. Their surveys covered about 5 different domains of leadership and looked at how their residents did in those domains, or how they felt like they did after their curriculum. We took those 5 domains and defined what we meant by, did the resident exhibit leadership during this case? You know, we're looking at their communication, we're looking at their teamwork, we're looking at their initiative. And so we tried to define what we meant by leadership when we asked the 3 parties to score the residents during the simulation. But yes, I agree that having objective third-party scores would be fantastic.
I'm going to dovetail on one of the earlier comments about particular skills and leadership training. I think it's really important to understand, like, you used the internal medicine model at Mass General as a good example. But it's not emergency medicine. So there are specific skills in leadership that I think apply more to emergency medicine than to other specialties. How would you go about identifying these particular skills in your place?
Sure. So I would agree that that it requires a different skill set, particularly resuscitations and the emergent nature of our job. However, I would push back on the fact that I think during a regular shift, most of what we're doing is not resuscitations. A lot of it is keeping your department headed towards where you want it to be in 8 hours when you leave your shift. It's about keeping flow going. It's about dealing with the patient who isn't having an emergency but is worried that they are. And I think that those skills do transcend specialty. So while I think from the WestGem standpoint, from the article that was done on trauma resuscitations and looking at, say, collaborative leadership versus directive leadership, I think there's a lot that can be done there when it comes to resuscitations and emergent procedures and emergent diagnoses. But on the whole, on an 8-hour shift, I think that there's a lot of crossover. I hope that answers the question. Any other questions? Again, I'm here afterwards. I'd love to talk to you if you're interested in building a similar curricula at your own place, or if you have other questions, please come find me afterwards. Thanks for being here.